Well, investigation is underway after a man was shot multiple times by Toronto police at Danforth GO station. For more on this, we're joined live by CB24's crime analyst, Steve Ryan, who is outside the GO train station. Steve, what do we know thus far? You spoke with the SIU.
Well, the SIU told us that the Toronto police received a radio call at 1:40 this morning regarding a person with a gun at the Danforth train station, and officers responded. 4 of them responded, and they located a man in a stairwell at the GO station, and the SIU said that this was a person of interest. So clearly what that means is that the description that was provided to the officers en route to the call, that person matched that description that the officers were made aware of. And they had an interaction with this man. One of the 4 officers discharged their firearm multiple times, striking this man multiple times, and he subsequently died as a result. There was a firearm seized at the scene. And I did speak during the press conference with the SIU. I did ask the SIU spokesperson if, in fact, the deceased pointed that firearm at the officer, and of course she said that it was far too early for them to make any sort of determination. But the important thing is here, the police are justified under the law in using lethal force if they are faced with imminent threat of serious bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, or death. And if there are 4 officers at a scene, Phil, what's important is it's not a collective. How do we feel? It's the observations, the perception of one officer. That's all that is required. And it is that officer's actions that will now be critiqued. So this one officer is the subject officer. The SIU will investigate that officer's actions to make sure that they were within the criminal code that justifies the police in using lethal force. And I say this all the time. The SIU have a very important job to do when they investigate these matters, because they are the checks and balances. They are the ones that make sure when the police use lethal force, which society gives them the right to do under the law, that they do it appropriately. And in this particular case, we'll have 3 officers that were witness officers to this event. They were the other 3 that responded. And we'll have the 1 officer being the subject officer, and that was the officer who discharged their firearm. Again, a gun was seized, and the Danforth station here is closed, and it'll be closed for some time while this investigation continues with the SIU. Phil.
And Steve, I got to ask, obviously you are a longtime police officer. You went through the training. What kind of training do officers go through now, in 2025, when faced with someone with a gun in a tight space? I've been on those stairwells. They're not very large. They're pretty tight in there at Danforth GO. What are they taught to do in a situation like this?
As far as I know, the firearms training has not changed, and it's pretty much standard. And this is what it says. An officer does not shoot to kill. You do not shoot to knock a knife or a gun out of somebody's hand, or shoot them in the leg to prevent them from running away. If you are faced with a threat of imminent bodily harm or death to yourself or to somebody else, you make that decision to use lethal force, you discharge that firearm to stop the threat. And you are trained to shoot for center mass, the chest. Why center mass? That's where you are almost guaranteed to stop that threat from continuing, because that's where all your major organs are. So you don't shoot to kill, and you shoot as many times as is required until you're satisfied that the threat no longer exists. So that could be 1 shot, or that could be you can empty a magazine, or you can empty 6, 7, 8 rounds. You shoot until that threat stops. And once that threat no longer exists, then you have to stop shooting. So that is all part of the in-depth training that police officers throughout the province, I'd say throughout the country, they go through. But there is no shooting to knock a weapon out of somebody's hand. You shoot center mass, which is the chest area, and you shoot as many rounds as is required to stop that threat from continuing.
So I got to ask, the SIU did say that the victim was shot multiple times. So obviously we don't have body cam footage, we don't have CCTV. So hearing that, what are you thinking in your former police officer mind?
Yeah. So, and this is just hypothetically, of course, we have no evidence as to what, or suggestions as to what's going on in that stairwell. But when you hear an officer fired multiple rounds, that tells me that the officer felt that the threat was continuing as shots were being fired. And it wasn't until that last shot was being fired that you were satisfied that there was no longer a threat, and that's when you stopped shooting. And that would be the answer, hypothetically, of course, when you're being interviewed by the SIU, if in fact that's what happened. If a person would say, hypothetically, an investigator would say, you fired 8 rounds. Why 8 rounds? That's how many rounds it took to stop the threat. That would be the simple question. But that's what the training says. The training says you continue to shoot until the threat is stopped. And it could be one shot or it could be multiple shots. You're not counting those shots. You're just shooting until that threat no longer exists. So just hearing this evidence, or this information, rather, not evidence, information that multiple shots were fired, it does suggest that the threat continued after one shot was fired, and then the officer felt that the need to continue shooting until that threat no longer existed. Given that a firearm was involved, that certainly would heighten that concern about the threat of imminent bodily harm or death. And again, it's not a collective, how do we all feel about this? It's how does the one officer feel? And it only takes one of them to make that decision for themselves, not for the entire group.
All right, Steve Ryan, thanks so much. I do appreciate that.